I should have expected the cold shoulder, but somehow I thought grief might make people more civil. Instead, as I stood in the back corner of the funeral home, watching my grandfather's relatives cluster around the casket in their expensive black suits, I felt more invisible than I had in years. "Excuse me," Mrs. Blackwood, my grandfather's neighbor of 30 years, approached with the kind of polite smile reserved for people you're trying to place. "Are you family?" "I'm David's granddaughter, Emma." Her expression shifted to confused recognition. "Oh, Emma, you look so different." Different from what, I wanted to ask. Different from the last time she'd seen me in my work clothes, coming to help grandfather with his garden? Different from her expectations of what a Blackwood family member should look like? "Well," she said after an awkward pause, "I'm sure David appreciated your visits." She drifted away before I could respond, leaving me standing alone again while the real family, my cousins Richard and Patricia, my uncle Charles and their spouses, held court near the front of the room, accepting condolences and sharing memories with the confidence of people who belonged. I'd known this would be difficult. Grandfather had been the only family member who'd maintained any relationship with me after I'd chosen social work over law school, after I'd moved into a modest apartment instead of the family compound, after I'd made it clear that I valued purpose over prestige. But I hadn't expected to feel quite so much like an outsider at his funeral. "Emma." The voice belonged to my cousin Richard, who approached with his wife Caroline in tow. At 45, Richard had inherited the family law firm and carried himself with the self-importance that came from never being questioned about his choices. "Richard, I'm sorry for your loss." "Our loss," he corrected, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely mean it. "Grandfather spoke of you often. He was very important to me." Caroline, resplendent in designer black, studied me with the kind of attention usually reserved for specimens. "Emma, we haven't seen you at any family gatherings in, how long has it been?" 5 years, I replied. 5 years since the last holiday dinner where every conversation had been a subtle reminder that I was the family disappointment, the granddaughter who'd squandered her potential on helping people instead of accumulating wealth. "Well," Richard said, glancing around the room as if looking for someone more important to talk to, "I'm sure grandfather understood that you've been busy with your work." The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable. I was the granddaughter who worked with homeless families, who drove a 10-year-old Honda, who lived in a neighborhood where people like Richard wouldn't feel safe parking their BMWs. I was family, but barely. The service itself was beautifully orchestrated, full of tributes to grandfather's business acumen, his charitable contributions, and his role as patriarch of a family that had been prominent in the city for 3 generations. Speaker after speaker praised his vision, his leadership, and his legacy. What they didn't mention was the way he'd shown up at my college graduation when my parents were too busy with a business conference to attend. They didn't talk about our Sunday morning walks through the botanical garden, where he'd listened to my stories about work challenges with genuine interest rather than thinly veiled disappointment. They didn't share how he'd been the only family member to visit my apartment, to meet my friends, to understand why I'd chosen meaning over money. I sat in the back, listening to eulogies that painted a picture of a man I'd known, but that felt incomplete without the grandfather who'd believed in me when everyone else had written me off. After the service, people gathered at the family estate for the reception. The house where I'd spent childhood holidays felt foreign now, filled with business associates and social acquaintances who discussed grandfather's legacy in terms of stock portfolios and real estate holdings. "Emma, dear." My Aunt Margaret found me standing alone on the terrace looking out over gardens that grandfather and I used to tend together. "How are you holding up?" Aunt Margaret had always been kinder than the rest of the family, though she'd married into money rather than being born to it, and sometimes seemed to understand the view from the outside. "I'm fine, Aunt Margaret, it's just difficult." "I know, sweetie. David was very proud of you, you know." "I'm not sure everyone else sees it that way." Margaret glanced back toward the house where my cousins were entertaining guests with stories about grandfather's business triumphs. "Some people measure worth differently than others. David always said you had the most generous heart of anyone in the family." "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, Emma. It's truth. David used to tell me about your work, about the families you've helped, about the difference you've made in people's lives. He said you understood what really mattered." Before I could respond, Richard appeared on the terrace, looking important and slightly impatient. "Emma, Aunt Margaret, we're gathering in the library for the reading of the will. Mr. Davidson is ready to begin." Mr. Davidson was grandfather's longtime attorney, a distinguished man in his 70s who'd handled the family's legal affairs for decades. The library was crowded with family members and a few close business associates, all seated in chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle, facing the massive mahogany desk where Mr. Davidson sat with several thick folders. I took a seat in the back, assuming this was largely ceremonial for me. Grandfather had been generous with small gifts over the years, helping with college expenses, contributing to causes I cared about, but the bulk of his estate would obviously go to the family members who'd remained in good standing, who'd followed expected paths and maintained appropriate relationships. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Davidson began, adjusting his glasses and opening the first folder. "We're here for the reading of the last will and testament of David Lawrence Blackwood, dated March 15th of this year." March 15th. That was just 2 months ago, I realized. Grandfather had updated his will just 2 months before his death. "The will is quite detailed," Mr. Davidson continued, "so I'll summarize the major provisions before reading specific bequests." He began with the charitable contributions, substantial donations to the Art Museum, the university, and several medical research foundations. Then came the personal bequests, jewelry to the women in the family, specific pieces of art and furniture to various relatives, and trust funds for the great-grandchildren's education. "The remainder of the estate," Mr. Davidson said, "including the family home, the business interests, and the investment portfolio, totaling approximately $47 million, is addressed in the final provision of the will." The room grew quiet. This was what everyone had been waiting for: the division of the real wealth, the legacy that would define the family's future. "I'll read this section in its entirety," Mr. Davidson announced and began. "To my family, I leave this final message along with my earthly possessions. Over the past several years, I have watched with interest how different members of my family have chosen to live their lives and express their values. Some have pursued wealth and status with admirable determination. Others have pursued meaning and service with equal dedication." I felt my stomach clench. This sounded like grandfather was about to deliver a posthumous lecture about family values and proper behavior. "After considerable reflection, I have decided that my estate should be entrusted to the family member who has best demonstrated the values I most admire: compassion for others, integrity in difficult circumstances, and commitment to making the world better rather than simply more profitable." Richard was leaning forward, clearly expecting his name to follow. Patricia had her hand on her husband's arm, preparing to accept the family mantle gracefully. "Therefore, I name my granddaughter Emma Rose Blackwood as the sole executor of my estate and the primary beneficiary of all assets not specifically designated for other recipients." The silence in the room was absolute. I felt like I'd been struck by lightning. "Emma will have complete discretion over the distribution and management of these assets, with the understanding that she will use them according to the principles of service and generosity that have guided her own life." Mr. Davidson looked up from the will, his eyes finding mine across the crowded room. "Miss Blackwood, this means you are now responsible for managing an estate worth approximately $47 million, including this house, your grandfather's business interests, and his investment portfolio." I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. Around me, I could see the shock and confusion on my relatives' faces as they realized that the family disappointment had just inherited everything. Richard found his voice first. "There must be some mistake. Emma hasn't been involved in family business affairs. She doesn't have experience managing this kind of responsibility." Mr. Davidson consulted his papers calmly. "Mr. Blackwood, the will is quite clear and specific. Your grandfather updated it recently and confirmed his intentions in a separate letter that I was instructed to read if there were any questions about his decision." "Please," Richard said, his composure cracking, "read the letter." Mr. Davidson opened another folder and withdrew a handwritten note. This is dated the same day as the will revision. It reads, "To my family. If you are hearing this letter, it means someone has questioned my decision to name Emma as my primary heir. Let me be clear about my reasoning." The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. "Emma is the only member of our family who has chosen service over selfishness, who has used her talents to help others rather than advance herself, who has remained humble despite being capable of greatness. She reminds me of the person I wish I had been at her age." I felt tears starting. remembering all the conversations grandfather and I had shared about purpose and meaning, about what constituted a life well lived. I am confident that Emma will use this inheritance not to elevate herself, but to elevate others. She will make decisions based on need rather than greed, service rather than status. She understands that wealth is a responsibility, not a privilege. The letter continued with specific instructions about business operations and investment management, but also with guidance about using the estate's resources for charitable purposes and community development. I asked my family to support Emma in this responsibility and to learn from her example. Perhaps being entrusted with significant resources will teach everyone what Emma already understands, that true success is measured by the lives you improve, not the wealth you accumulate. When Mr. Davidson finished reading, the silence stretched uncomfortably. I could see Richard and Patricia exchanging glances, probably calculating legal challenges and inheritance disputes. Uncle Charles looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. "Emma," Mr. Davidson said gently, "do you accept the responsibilities outlined in your grandfather's will?" I thought about grandfather's trust in me, about the magnitude of what he was asking me to do, about the family relationships this decision would inevitably complicate. "I accept," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The reception that followed was surreal. Word spread quickly through the house about the will's contents. And suddenly, people who'd barely acknowledged my presence were approaching me with new interest and poorly concealed calculations. "Emma, congratulations," said Mrs. Blackwood, the neighbor who'd struggled to place me earlier. "I'm sure you'll do wonderful things with David's legacy." Business associates who'd looked through me during the service now wanted to discuss investment strategies and portfolio management. Family friends who'd treated me like hired help during previous gatherings were suddenly fascinated by my insights and opinions. But the most difficult conversations were with my own family. "Emma," Patricia cornered me in the hallway, her usual poise replaced by barely controlled emotion, "we need to talk about this situation." Grandfather was elderly, possibly influenced by sentiment over practical considerations. "Patricia, the will is clear and legally sound." Mr. Davidson confirmed that grandfather was of sound mind when he made these decisions. "But Emma, you have to understand our position. Richard has been groomed to take over the family businesses. I've been involved in managing the charitable foundation for years. We have experience with this level of responsibility. And I have experience with the kind of work grandfather wanted this inheritance to support." Patricia's mask slipped completely. "Emma, you work with homeless people. You live in an apartment that costs less than our monthly grocery budget. How can you possibly manage a $47 million estate?" The question hung between us, carrying all the assumptions and dismissals that had characterized my relationship with the family for years. "Patricia, maybe the fact that I don't live extravagantly is exactly why grandfather trusted me with this responsibility." "This is ridiculous," Richard interrupted, joining our conversation with the aggressive confidence that had served him well in courtrooms. "Emma, be reasonable. You can't possibly want this burden. Let's work out something that makes sense for everyone. You keep a generous portion of the inheritance, and those of us with relevant experience handle the business operations." "Richard, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not looking to negotiate away grandfather's final wishes." "Emma," Uncle Charles approached with Caroline and Aunt Margaret in tow, "perhaps we should sit down as a family and discuss how to handle this transition. There are tax implications, business relationships, legal responsibilities that require immediate attention." I looked around at my family members, seeing the mixture of shock, resentment, and calculation in their expressions. They were struggling to reconcile the Emma they'd dismissed with the Emma who now controlled their family's financial future. "You're right that there are immediate responsibilities," I agreed. "Mr. Davidson and I will be meeting tomorrow to review all the estate's holdings and obligations. I'll need time to understand the full scope of what grandfather has entrusted to me." "And then?" Richard asked. "And then I'll make decisions based on grandfather's wishes and my own judgment about how to honor his legacy." The family gathering broke up shortly afterward. With relatives departing in small groups, their conversations undoubtedly focused on strategies for influencing or challenging the new reality. I found myself alone in grandfather's library, surrounded by books and memories and the overwhelming weight of responsibility he'd placed on my shoulders. Mr. Davidson had stayed behind to discuss immediate practical matters: account access, business operations, legal authorizations that needed to be transferred to my name. "Miss Blackwood," he said as we concluded our preliminary review, "I hope you understand that your grandfather's decision wasn't impulsive." He spoke with me several times over the past year about his concerns regarding the family's direction and his desire to ensure his legacy served purposes he valued. "Mr. Davidson, can I ask you something honestly? Do you think grandfather made the right choice?" The elderly attorney studied me with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating character and capability. "Miss Blackwood, in 40 years of practice, I've seen many wealthy families struggle with succession and inheritance. I've watched business empires crumble because they were inherited by people who viewed wealth as an entitlement rather than a responsibility." He gathered his papers methodically before continuing. "Your grandfather believed that you understood something his other heirs didn't: that wealth is a tool for creating positive change rather than simply a means of personal comfort. Based on my observations of your character and your family's reactions today, I believe his assessment was accurate." As I drove home to my modest apartment that evening, I reflected on the day that had transformed me from family disappointment to family decision-maker. The inheritance was overwhelming. Not just the money, but the trust grandfather had placed in me and the expectations that came with honoring his memory appropriately. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from relatives who wanted to discuss the situation, but I let them go to voicemail. I needed time to process what had happened and plan how to move forward in ways that would justify grandfather's faith in me. The apartment that had seemed perfectly adequate that morning now felt strange, knowing that I could afford to live anywhere but choosing to remain in a place that reflected my values rather than my net worth. The contrast wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years being dismissed for living modestly, and now that modesty was exactly what grandfather had trusted me to maintain. Over the following weeks, as I met with financial advisors, business managers, and attorneys to understand the full scope of the estate, I began to grasp the magnitude of what grandfather had built and what he was asking me to steward. The business interests alone employed over 300 people. The investment portfolio generated returns that could fund significant charitable work indefinitely. The real estate holdings included properties that could house dozens of families. But I also began to understand why grandfather had been concerned about leaving this inheritance to family members, who viewed wealth primarily as a source of personal advantage. During every meeting, someone would suggest strategies for maximizing returns or leveraging assets that focused entirely on increasing the estate's value rather than considering its potential for community impact. "Miss Blackwood," my new financial advisor suggested during our third meeting, "you might consider liquidating some of the smaller business holdings and consolidating into higher-yield investments. Your current portfolio is quite conservative." Conservative how? Well, several of the businesses prioritize employee benefits and community development over profit margins. From a purely financial perspective, you could increase returns significantly by restructuring operations to focus on profitability. I thought about the 300 employees whose livelihoods depended on businesses that treated them well, about the communities that benefited from companies that invested locally rather than extracting resources for distant shareholders. "I think I'll maintain the current approach," I decided. Grandfather's businesses were successful precisely because they balanced profitability with social responsibility. The advisor looked puzzled, clearly accustomed to clients who prioritized maximum returns over community impact. Similar conversations occurred with every professional I consulted. Estate planners who wanted to establish tax avoidance strategies that would benefit me personally. Investment managers who recommended high-risk, high-reward portfolios that could triple the estate's value within 5 years. Real estate developers who saw opportunities to convert grandfather's properties into more profitable uses. Each suggestion made me understand more clearly why grandfather had chosen me as his heir. He'd wanted someone who would preserve not just his wealth but his values. Someone who understood that the point of having resources wasn't to accumulate more resources, but to use them for purposes that mattered. 3 months after the funeral, I was ready to announce my plans for the estate. I invited the family to gather at grandfather's house, now my house, for what I described as a legacy planning meeting. They arrived with obvious expectations and poorly concealed strategies. Richard brought his lawyer. Patricia carried folders of business proposals. Uncle Charles had prepared what looked like a formal presentation about family financial management. "Thank you all for coming," I began, standing in the same library where we'd learned about Grandfather's will. I wanted to share my decisions about how to honor Grandfather's legacy and fulfill the responsibilities he's entrusted to me. The room was tense with anticipation and anxiety. First, I want to assure everyone that I take seriously both the financial and family obligations that come with this inheritance. Grandfather built something valuable, and I intend to preserve and expand that value, though perhaps not in ways you might expect. I outlined my plans systematically, maintaining current business operations while expanding employee benefits and community investment programs, establishing an educational foundation that would provide scholarships and support services for first-generation college students, converting several properties into affordable housing for working families, and creating an endowment that would fund social services in underserved communities. The estate will continue to be profitable, I explained, but profits will be reinvested in programs that serve community development rather than personal wealth accumulation. Richard spoke first, his lawyer's training helping him maintain composure despite obvious frustration. "Emma, these are admirable goals, but they don't address the family's legitimate expectations regarding inheritance and ongoing financial security." "Richard, the will made specific bequests to family members, and those will be honored completely. Beyond that, Grandfather chose to entrust the bulk of his estate to charitable purposes rather than family enrichment." "But Emma," Patricia interjected, "we're talking about $47 million. Surely some of that could be allocated to family trusts, business expansions that would benefit everyone, investments that would preserve wealth for future generations." I thought about the conversations I'd had with Grandfather about wealth and responsibility, about his concerns that family members were more interested in maintaining privilege than creating value. "Patricia, I think Grandfather's concern was exactly that focusing on preserving wealth for the family might prevent using that wealth for broader purposes that could benefit many more people." "So you're choosing strangers over family?" Uncle Charles asked, his tone carrying hurt as well as anger. "I'm choosing the approach that Grandfather specifically requested in his will, and that aligns with the values he tried to teach all of us." The meeting continued for 2 hours, with family members arguing, pleading, and threatening various forms of resistance to my plans. But I'd spent months preparing for these conversations, both legally and emotionally, and I understood that honoring Grandfather's trust required maintaining his vision, even when it disappointed people I loved. As the family departed that evening, their faces showing mixtures of resignation, resentment, and in a few cases, grudging respect, I realized that being named executor hadn't just given me control over Grandfather's money, it had given me the opportunity to prove that his faith in me was justified. 6 months later, the Emma Blackwood Educational Foundation had provided scholarships to 47 first-generation college students. The Affordable Housing Initiative had enabled 12 families to move from unstable rental situations into homes they could afford. The Community Development Endowment was funding after-school programs, job training services, and family support systems that were making measurable differences in people's lives. The Foundation's first annual report included letters from beneficiaries that reminded me why Grandfather had valued service over status. A single mother who was completing nursing school while raising 3 children. A young man who'd grown up in foster care and was now studying social work. Families who'd moved from homeless shelters into stable housing where their children could thrive. "Miss Blackwood," said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the Foundation's program director, "I wanted to share something with you that I think would have made your grandfather proud." "What's that?" "Several of our scholarship recipients have started volunteering with the community programs we fund. They're using their educational opportunities to give back immediately, rather than waiting until they've established themselves professionally." Dr. Martinez showed me photos from a recent volunteer event, college students tutoring children in our after-school programs, scholarship recipients helping families navigate housing applications, young people who'd benefited from Foundation services now providing those same services to others. They understand that receiving help creates an obligation to help others. That's exactly the cycle of generosity your grandfather was hoping to create. A year after the funeral, where I'd been treated like a nobody, I was invited to speak at the city's annual Philanthropy Awards dinner. The invitation was both recognition of the foundation's impact and acknowledgement that the family disappointment had become someone worth listening to. Ladies and gentlemen, I began my remarks, looking out over an audience that included many of the same people who'd dismissed me at grandfather's reception. I want to share something my grandfather taught me about the difference between inheriting wealth and inheriting responsibility. I talked about grandfather's belief that true success was measured by community impact rather than personal accumulation, about the foundation's work and the multiplier effects of providing opportunities rather than just charity, about the responsibility that came with having resources in a world where many people lacked basic necessities. The most important inheritance my grandfather left wasn't money, I concluded. It was the understanding that wealth is a tool for creating opportunities for others to discover their own potential and use it in service of something larger than themselves. After my speech, several people approached with interest in supporting the foundation's work or replicating its model in other communities. But the conversation that meant the most came from Patricia, who'd driven downtown specifically to attend the dinner. "Emma," she said as the event concluded, "I owe you an apology that's a year overdue." "Patricia, you don't need to apologize. I understand that grandfather's decision was shocking and difficult for everyone. I do need to apologize, Emma. Not just for questioning his decision, but for spending years dismissing your choices and your values. Watching what you've built with the foundation, seeing the impact you've created, I finally understand what grandfather saw in you." Patricia paused, her usual poise replaced by genuine emotion. "You were never the family disappointment, Emma. You were the family member who understood what really mattered, even when the rest of us didn't." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey from invisibility to influence, from being overlooked to being entrusted with resources that could change lives. The inheritance had been overwhelming initially, but it had also been exactly what grandfather had intended. An opportunity to prove that service was more satisfying than status, that creating opportunities for others was more meaningful than accumulating advantages for yourself. They'd treated me like a nobody at the funeral because they'd measured my worth by conventional standards: job prestige, personal wealth, adherence to family expectations. But grandfather had measured my worth by different criteria: compassion, integrity, commitment to making the world better. The will that named me executor hadn't just transferred legal authority, it had validated choices I'd made despite family pressure, values I'd maintained despite social expectations, and principles I'd lived by even when they seemed to limit my options. A year later, the foundation was thriving, the family relationships had stabilized into something resembling mutual respect, and I'd learned that being trusted with significant resources was both a privilege and a responsibility that required constant attention to ensure the inheritance served purposes larger than personal comfort. At the funeral, they'd treated me like a nobody because they couldn't see past their assumptions about success and worth. But grandfather had seen something they'd missed, that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money. It was the opportunity to use whatever resources you'd been given to create possibilities for others to build meaningful lives. The nobody they'd dismissed had become someone who proved that true wealth lay in what you created for others, rather than what you accumulated for yourself. And that transformation honored both grandfather's memory and the trust he'd placed in someone who understood that being overlooked was often just the beginning of the most important stories. 5 years after the funeral, I was reviewing applications for the foundation's newest initiative, when my assistant announced that I had an unexpected visitor. Richard stood in the doorway of my office, looking considerably older than his 50 years, and carrying himself with none of the arrogant confidence I remembered from family gatherings. "Emma, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I know we haven't spoken much since the estate was settled." I gestured for him to sit in the chair across from my desk, noting that he seemed nervous in a way I'd never seen before. The family law firm that had been his inheritance and identity was located just 6 blocks away, but Richard looked like he'd traveled much farther to reach my office. "Richard, what can I do for you?" He was quiet for a moment, studying the photos on my wall that documented 5 years of foundation work, scholarship recipients at college graduations, families moving into new homes, community centers bustling with children and families. "Emma, I need to ask for your help. Not as family, but as someone who's built something I'm finally beginning to understand. The request was so unexpected that I wasn't sure how to respond. Richard had spent the past 5 years maintaining polite but distant relations with me, attending foundation events when social obligations required, but never showing genuine interest in the work itself. What kind of help? Richard pulled out a folder that looked official and substantial. The firm is in trouble. Serious financial trouble. We've lost 3 major clients in the past year, our operating expenses have outpaced revenues for 18 months, and I'm looking at the possibility of bankruptcy within 6 months. I studied Richard's face, seeing genuine fear beneath his attempt at professional composure. The law firm that had been in the family for 3 generations, that had been his birthright and primary source of identity, was failing under his leadership. Richard, I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not sure how I can help with legal business challenges. Emma, the firm's problems aren't just financial, they're philosophical. We've been operating according to principles that worked for grandfather's generation, but don't connect with current clients or community needs. Richard opened his folder and showed me client feedback surveys and employee exit interviews that painted a troubling picture of a firm that prioritized billable hours over client outcomes, profit margins over community service, and traditional prestige over innovative problem solving. Our clients are saying we're out of touch with their actual needs. Our younger attorneys are leaving for firms that offer more meaningful work. We've become exactly what grandfather was worried the family would become: successful on paper but irrelevant in practice. I began to understand why Richard was sitting in my office rather than consulting with traditional business advisors. Richard, what are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to teach me how to rebuild something that serves people instead of just serving itself. You've created an organization that attracts talented people who want to do meaningful work. I want to learn how to do the same thing. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Richard describing the firm's challenges and his growing understanding that conventional approaches to law practice weren't sustainable in a community that valued service over status. Emma, I've been watching what you've built with the foundation, and I realize that everything grandfather tried to teach us about service and responsibility went into your work while I was focused on maintaining what he'd already built. Richard, transformation is possible, but it requires fundamental changes in how you approach client relationships and measure success. I understand that. I'm prepared to make those changes, but I need guidance from someone who understands both the business challenges and the values that should guide the solutions. Over the following months, Richard and I worked together to restructure the family law firm according to principles of community service and client advocacy rather than purely profit-driven legal representation. It was challenging work that required Richard to reconsider everything he'd learned about practicing law and managing a business. The key insight, I explained during one of our planning sessions, is that sustainable success comes from solving real problems for people who need help, not from maximizing revenue from clients who can afford premium fees. We developed new practice areas focused on serving families and small businesses that had been underserved by traditional legal firms: affordable family law services, small business development legal support, and community advocacy work that addressed systemic problems rather than just individual cases. Richard, this approach will probably reduce your profit margins initially, but it will also create client loyalty and community impact that generates long-term sustainability. Emma, I'm beginning to understand something that took me too long to recognize. Grandfather's real legacy wasn't the money he accumulated. It was the example he set about using professional skills to serve community needs. The law firm's transformation attracted attention from other family members who were struggling with similar questions about purpose and meaning in their own careers. Patricia, who'd been managing charitable giving for several wealthy families, approached me about collaborating on philanthropic strategies that created measurable community impact rather than just providing tax benefits for donors. Emma, I've been studying the Foundation's model and I'm interested in adapting those principles to help other wealthy families give more effectively. Patricia's proposal led to the development of a philanthropic consulting practice that helped donors move beyond traditional charity toward strategic community investment that addressed root causes of social problems. The families I work with have resources to make significant differences, Patricia explained, but they often lack the frameworks for evaluating impact and ensuring their giving creates lasting change rather than temporary relief. Uncle Charles surprised everyone by requesting similar guidance for restructuring his investment portfolio to focus on companies that demonstrated both financial performance and social responsibility. Emma, I've spent my career maximizing returns without considering the broader implications of where I invested. Watching your work has made me realize that I could use my investment expertise to support businesses that serve community development. Charles developed what he called values-based investing, identifying companies that achieved strong financial performance while maintaining high standards for employee treatment, environmental responsibility, and community engagement. The remarkable thing, Charles reported, after a year of implementing this approach, is that companies with strong social values often outperform traditional investments over time because they're building sustainable rather than extractive business models. 3 years later, the Blackwood family had undergone a transformation that none of us could have anticipated. Richard's law firm was thriving by serving clients who'd been overlooked by traditional legal practices. Patricia's philanthropic consulting had helped establish community-focused giving programs in 12 cities. Charles's investment approach was generating superior returns while supporting businesses that served social development. Emma, Aunt Margaret observed during our annual family gathering, "You've managed to accomplish something I didn't think was possible. You've helped this family rediscover its values without forcing anyone to abandon their professional ambitions." The gathering was held at the family estate that I'd inherited but transformed into a community education center. The grand rooms that had once hosted exclusive social events now served as meeting spaces for nonprofit organizations, classrooms for adult education programs, and gathering areas for community events. "The beautiful thing," I replied, "is that everyone found their own way to align their work with their values. I didn't teach anyone what to do. I just shared examples of how professional success and community service could support each other." But the most meaningful transformation wasn't professional. It was personal. Richard had become someone I genuinely enjoyed working with, someone who'd learned to measure success by client outcomes rather than billable hours. Patricia had evolved from someone focused on maintaining social status to someone passionate about effective philanthropy. Charles had discovered that investing according to his values was more satisfying than simply maximizing returns. "Emma," Richard said during the family dinner, "I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. When Grandfather named you as executor, I thought he'd made a terrible mistake. I believed that business experience and financial knowledge were the only qualifications that mattered for managing his legacy." Richard paused, looking around the room where family members were discussing collaborative projects and community impact rather than personal achievements and social positioning. "I was wrong about everything. Grandfather didn't choose you because he wanted someone to preserve what he'd built. He chose you because he wanted someone who would transform what he'd built into something better." Richard, transformation was always possible for everyone. The inheritance just provided resources that made it easier to choose service over self-interest. "But Emma, that's exactly the point. Having resources didn't automatically make any of us more generous or community-minded. You had to show us that using wealth to serve others was more satisfying than using it to serve ourselves." 6 months later, I was invited to speak at the National Conference on Family Philanthropy, where business families from across the country gathered to discuss strategies for passing on both wealth and values to future generations. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began my keynote address, "I want to share what I've learned about the difference between inheriting money and inheriting responsibility, and how families can ensure that wealth serves character development rather than replacing it." I talked about the Blackwood family's transformation, about the law firm that had found new purpose in community service, about the investment practices that aligned profit with principles, about the philanthropic work that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms of social problems. "The most important lesson we learned," I concluded, "is that wealth can either isolate families from their communities or connect them more deeply to community needs. The choice depends on whether you use resources to elevate yourselves or to elevate others." After my speech, several audience members approached with questions about replicating our model in their own families and communities. But the conversation that meant the most came from a young woman who introduced herself as Jennifer Blackwood Chen, Richard's 22-year-old daughter. "Aunt Emma, I wanted to thank you for showing our family what meaningful success looks like. Watching the foundation's work and seeing how Dad transformed his law practice has helped me understand what I want to do with my own career." Jennifer explained that she was completing her master's degree in social work, and planned to focus on family services that addressed both immediate needs and systemic barriers to economic stability. I want to work with families who are facing the same challenges that your foundation addresses, but I want to approach the work from the perspective of someone who understands both social services and business development. Jennifer's career goals represented the next generation of family evolution, young people who'd grown up understanding that professional success and community service weren't competing priorities, but complementary aspects of meaningful work. Jennifer, that's exactly the kind of integrated thinking that creates lasting change. You'll be able to help families navigate immediate crises, while also addressing the systemic issues that create those crises. And Emma, I hope someday I can build something that has the same kind of impact that you've created. I want to honor great-grandfather's legacy, while also building on what you've taught our family about service and responsibility. 10 years after the funeral, where I'd been treated like a nobody, the Blackwood Foundation had grown into a nationally recognized model for community-based philanthropy that addressed education, housing, and economic development in integrated ways. The family business enterprises had been transformed into community-serving organizations that demonstrated how profitability and social responsibility could support each other. But the most satisfying development was watching family members discover that meaningful work was more fulfilling than prestigious work, that serving community needs was more satisfying than accumulating personal advantages. Richard had become a respected advocate for legal reforms that made justice more accessible to working families. Patricia's philanthropic consulting had helped establish effective giving programs in over 30 cities. Charles's investment approach had become a model for socially responsible finance that generated strong returns while supporting community development. Emma, Richard said during a recent family meeting, I've been thinking about something that grandfather wrote in his letter about learning from your example. I finally understand what he meant. What's that? He wasn't asking us to become like you, Emma. He was asking us to become the best versions of ourselves, while keeping community service at the center of whatever we chose to do professionally. And have you been able to do that? I think so. The law firm now serves families and small businesses that couldn't afford legal representation before. We're profitable, but we're also contributing to community development in ways that feel meaningful rather than just financially successful. Patricia nodded in agreement. Emma, working with donor families has taught me that having resources creates opportunities to make meaningful differences, but only if you approach giving strategically rather than just writing checks to feel charitable. Charles, how has the investment transformation felt from your perspective? Honestly, Emma, it's been the most satisfying decade of my professional life. Instead of just maximizing returns, I'm helping build businesses that serve community needs while generating profits. It's more complex than traditional investing, but it's also more meaningful. As I listened to my family members describe work that aligned their professional skills with their values, I understood that grandfather's trust in me had been about more than managing money effectively. He'd wanted me to demonstrate that service-oriented approaches to business and philanthropy weren't just idealistic concepts. They were practical strategies that created sustainable success while addressing community needs. The inheritance that had shocked everyone at the funeral reading had become the foundation for family transformation that honored both individual ambitions and collective responsibility. We'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured by what you accumulated for yourself, but by what you created for others and what you inspired others to create in turn. They'd treated me like a nobody at the funeral because they'd measured worth by conventional standards that I'd never tried to meet. But grandfather had measured worth by different criteria, and his trust in me had validated choices I'd made, despite family pressure and social expectations. 10 years later, the nobody they'd dismissed had become someone who'd helped an entire family rediscover that true success meant using whatever advantages you possessed to create opportunities for others to discover and develop their own potential. The will that had named me executor hadn't just transferred financial authority, it had provided resources and responsibility that enabled me to prove that service was more satisfying than status, that community impact was more meaningful than personal accumulation, and that the best inheritances were the ones that kept giving long after the original gift was shared. Grandfather's legacy lived not just in the foundation's work or the family's transformation, but in the understanding that wealth was a tool for creating possibilities rather than just a measure of personal success. And that understanding would continue through Jennifer's generation and beyond, ensuring that the values grandfather had trusted me to preserve would guide future decisions about how to use resources in service of something larger than individual comfort or family advantage. At the funeral, they treated me like a nobody because they couldn't see past their assumptions about worth and success. But the nobody they'd overlooked had become someone who understood that the most meaningful inheritance was the opportunity to transform received advantages into shared benefits that served the ongoing development of community and family alike. The executor they'd never expected had become exactly what grandfather had hoped for. Someone who could preserve his values while adapting his resources to serve evolving community needs. Someone who understood that true wealth lay in what you enabled others to achieve, rather than what you achieved for yourself. 15 years after the funeral, I was preparing for what I'd decided would be my final year as executive director of the Blackwood Foundation, when I received a call that reminded me how much the family had truly changed. "Aunt Emma," Jennifer's voice carried excitement that was audible even through the phone, "I have news that I think will make you proud. And maybe a little surprised." Jennifer was now 37, had earned her doctorate in social work, and was running a family services organization that had become a model for integrated support systems across 3 states. Her work combined the practical skills she'd learned from foundation programs with innovative approaches to addressing systemic poverty that she'd developed through her academic research. "What's the news? I've been selected as one of 5 finalists for the MacArthur Fellowship. The committee said my work on, quote, comprehensive family stability programming represents exactly the kind of innovation they want to support." The MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, represented recognition at the highest levels of social innovation. Jennifer had developed programs that addressed housing, education, employment, and healthcare needs simultaneously, creating coordinated support systems that helped families achieve genuine stability rather than just temporary relief. "Jennifer, that's extraordinary. Your great-grandfather would be so proud to see what you've built." "Aunt Emma, that's actually why I'm calling. If I receive the fellowship, I want to use it to establish something I'm calling the Blackwood Institute for Family Systems Innovation. But I want to make sure you think it's an appropriate way to honor great-grandfather's legacy." Jennifer's proposal was ambitious and thoughtful. A research and training center that would study effective approaches to family support services and train practitioners from around the country in comprehensive intervention methodologies. The institute would be affiliated with the foundation but independent enough to conduct research and develop training programs that other organizations could adapt to their own communities. "Jennifer, that sounds like exactly the kind of systemic thinking that your great-grandfather valued. But why are you asking for my approval?" "Because you're the person who taught our family that meaningful work requires both vision and practical implementation. I want to make sure my vision aligns with the principles that have guided the foundation's success." 2 weeks later, Jennifer called with news that the MacArthur Committee had indeed selected her for the fellowship, citing her, quote, innovative approach to addressing family poverty through integrated service delivery that treats families as complex systems rather than collections of individual problems. The announcement generated significant media attention, not just because of Jennifer's age and accomplishments, but because of her family connection to what journalists were calling the Blackwood model of community-based philanthropy. Ms. Blackwood, a reporter from the Washington Post, asked during Jennifer's press conference, "Your family's approach to philanthropy has influenced policy discussions at the federal level. Do you see your work as carrying forward that legacy?" "I see my work as building on lessons my family learned about the difference between providing charity and creating opportunities," Jennifer replied. "My great-grandfather understood that lasting change comes from addressing systems rather than just symptoms, and my Aunt Emma demonstrated how to implement that understanding effectively." The MacArthur Fellowship announcement brought unexpected attention to the entire family's transformation. Business magazines wanted to interview Richard about converting traditional law practices into community-serving enterprises. Philanthropic publications sought Patricia's insights about effective donor education and strategic giving. Financial journals asked Charles to explain how values-based investing could generate competitive returns while supporting social development. "Emma," Richard said during a family dinner celebrating Jennifer's fellowship, "I never imagined that the legal work I'm doing now would be considered innovative or newsworthy. But apparently there's significant interest in how traditional professional practices can be restructured to serve broader community needs." Richard's law firm had become a case study taught in law schools across the country, demonstrating how legal practices could remain profitable while prioritizing client outcomes over billable hours and community impact over individual case victories. The remarkable thing, he continued, is that serving clients who couldn't afford traditional legal fees has turned out to be more satisfying and more sustainable than competing for wealthy corporate clients. Patricia had similar experiences with her philanthropic consulting work, which had expanded into a national practice helping wealthy families develop giving strategies that created measurable community impact. Emma, I've discovered that helping donors understand the difference between charity and investment in community development is more complex but more rewarding than simply managing charitable tax deductions. Charles had evolved his values-based investment approach into what was now called the Blackwood investment model, which prioritized companies that demonstrated both strong financial performance and commitment to employee welfare, environmental responsibility, and community development. The investment returns have been consistently strong, Charles reported, but what's really satisfying is knowing that our portfolio supports businesses that are solving problems, rather than just generating profits. But the most meaningful development wasn't professional recognition. It was watching the next generation of family members integrate service and success from the beginning of their careers, rather than learning these lessons through midlife transformation. Jennifer's younger brother, Michael, had graduated from medical school and was completing his residency in family medicine, with plans to establish a community health clinic that would serve uninsured families while training medical students in comprehensive patient care. Uncle Emma, Michael explained during a recent visit, I want to create a medical practice that addresses both individual health needs and community health systems. Treating patients effectively requires understanding their economic circumstances, housing situations, educational needs, all the factors that influence health outcomes. Richard's oldest son, David, had earned his MBA and was working with social enterprises that use business strategies to address environmental and social challenges. Aunt Emma, watching Dad transform his law practice, taught me that business skills can be tools for community development rather than just personal advancement. I want to help organizations scale their social impact while maintaining financial sustainability. Even the youngest family members were absorbing lessons about service and responsibility. Jennifer's 10-year-old daughter, Sarah, had started a recycling program at her elementary school and was using the proceeds to fund school supplies for classmates whose families couldn't afford them. Mommy says that when you have more than you need, you should help people who don't have enough, Sarah explained during a family gathering. I have lots of toys and books, so I can share them with kids who don't. 20 years after the funeral where I'd been treated like a nobody, the transformation of the Blackwood family had become a case study in how inherited wealth could serve character development rather than replacing it. Business schools taught courses on the Blackwood model of aligning professional success with community service. Philanthropic organizations studied our approach to sustainable giving that addressed root causes rather than symptoms of social problems. But the recognition that meant the most came from an unexpected source: a letter from Mrs. Elizabeth Harrison, grandfather's former neighbor who'd struggled to place me at the funeral. Dear Emma, the letter began, I owe you an apology that's 20 years overdue. At your grandfather's funeral, I failed to recognize the exceptional character that David saw in you so clearly. Mrs. Harrison, now in her 80s, explained that she'd been following the foundation's work and the family's transformation through local media coverage. Watching what you've built with David's legacy and seeing how you've helped your entire family discover more meaningful approaches to their professional work, I finally understand what David meant when he used to tell me that you were the family member who truly understood what mattered. I spent decades observing your family's social and business activities, but I never understood the difference between achieving success and creating significance, until I saw what you accomplished with resources that could have been used simply to maintain privilege and status. Mrs. Harrison's letter continued with reflections on community changes she'd witnessed as a result of foundation programming and family business transformations. The neighborhood where I've lived for 40 years has been revitalized, not through gentrification that displaces existing residents, but through programs that help current families achieve stability and prosperity. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful community development that David always hoped his wealth would eventually support. The letter concluded with an observation that captured something essential about the journey from dismissal to recognition. Emma, 20 years ago, I made assumptions about your worth based on superficial observations about your lifestyle and career choices. I failed to recognize that you were living according to values that made you exactly the right person to inherit David's legacy and transform it into something that honored both his memory and your own principles. As I prepared for my transition out of active foundation leadership, I reflected on the unexpected directions life had taken since that day when Mr. Davidson had read grandfather's will in the family library. The inheritance that had shocked everyone had become the foundation for family transformation that honored both individual ambitions and collective responsibility for community development. Jennifer was ready to take over as the foundation's executive director while establishing her Institute for Family Systems Innovation. Richard's law firm had become a model for community-serving legal practice that other attorneys were replicating in their own communities. Patricia's philanthropic consulting was helping wealthy families across the country develop more effective approaches to charitable giving. Charles's investment model was influencing how institutional investors evaluated companies based on social responsibility, as well as financial performance. Emma, Aunt Margaret observed during my retirement celebration, David chose well when he named you as executor, but I don't think even he anticipated how completely you would transform not just his legacy, but the entire family's understanding of what wealth and success could mean. The celebration was held in the Community Education Center that had once been the family estate, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by foundation programming and family business transformation. Scholarship recipients who'd become teachers, doctors, and social workers. Families who'd moved from unstable housing into homes they owned. Small business owners who'd received legal and financial support that enabled them to serve their communities while supporting their families. The most remarkable thing, I said during my remarks, isn't what we accomplished with grandfather's inheritance. It's what we learned about the relationship between having resources and using them to create opportunities for others to discover their own potential. Jennifer, soon to become the foundation's new leader, added her own perspective about continuing the work while adapting it to address evolving community needs. Aunt Emma taught our family that the most meaningful inheritance isn't money. It's the understanding that whatever advantages you possess create responsibilities to help others achieve their own versions of success. As the celebration continued around me, I thought about the journey from invisibility to influence, from being dismissed as the family disappointment to being trusted with resources that had changed thousands of lives. The inheritance had been overwhelming initially, but it had also been exactly what grandfather had intended, an opportunity to prove that service was more satisfying than status, that creating opportunities for others was more meaningful than accumulating advantages for yourself. The most satisfying aspect of retirement wasn't the recognition or gratitude, though both were meaningful. It was knowing that the work would continue under leadership that understood both its practical requirements and its underlying values. Jennifer and her generation had absorbed lessons about service and responsibility that would guide their own decisions about how to use whatever resources they accumulated or inherited. At the funeral 20 years earlier, they'd treated me like a nobody because they'd measured my worth by conventional standards that I'd never tried to meet. But grandfather had measured worth by different criteria, and his trust in me had validated choices I'd made despite family pressure and social expectations. The nobody they'd dismissed had become someone who proved that true wealth lay in what you created for others, rather than what you accumulated for yourself. The executor they'd never expected had become exactly what grandfather had hoped for, someone who could preserve his values while adapting his resources to serve evolving community needs. And now, as I prepared to step back from active leadership while remaining available for guidance and support, I understood that the most important legacy wasn't the foundation's programs or the family's transformation. It was the demonstration that being underestimated was often just the beginning of the most meaningful stories, and that the greatest inheritances were the ones that kept giving long after the original gift was shared. The will that had named me executor hadn't just transferred financial authority. It had provided the opportunity to prove that service-oriented approaches to wealth and family responsibility weren't just idealistic concepts but practical strategies that created sustainable success while addressing genuine community needs. 20 years later, The family that had once measured success by accumulation had learned to measure it by contribution. And that transformation honored both grandfather's memory and the trust he'd placed in someone who understood that being overlooked was often just the first chapter of stories that changed the world. 25 years after the funeral, at the age of 78, I found myself facing my own mortality and the responsibility of ensuring that the Blackwood legacy would continue serving community needs long after I was gone. The foundation had grown beyond anything grandfather could have imagined, operating programs in 17 states and influencing policy discussions at the federal level. But I'd learned that institutions were only as sustainable as the values that guided them. Jennifer had been leading the foundation brilliantly for 5 years, but she'd recently approached me with concerns that reflected the same questions about wealth and responsibility that had shaped my own inheritance decisions decades earlier. "Aunt Emma," she said during one of our monthly planning meetings, "I've been thinking about succession planning for the foundation, and I'm worried about something that might sound familiar to you." "What's that?" "The foundation has grown so successful and well-funded that it's attracting board members and staff who are more interested in managing a prestigious organization than in serving community needs. I'm concerned that we might be losing the connection to actual families and individuals that made our programming effective." Jennifer's concern was valid and troubling. Success often brought its own challenges, including the tendency for organizations to become more focused on maintaining their status than on fulfilling their mission. "Jennifer, what specific changes are you observing?" "Board meetings that focus more on endowment growth than program outcomes. Staff recommendations that prioritize projects that will generate media attention rather than interventions that address genuine community needs. Donor events that feel more like social gatherings than opportunities to discuss meaningful impact." I'd seen similar patterns in other philanthropic organizations and had always worried that the Blackwood Foundation might eventually face the same temptations toward institutional self-preservation over community service. "Jennifer, you're describing exactly the concerns that led grandfather to restructure his will in the first place. He was worried that family members were more interested in maintaining privilege than in creating value. So how do we prevent the foundation from becoming what our family used to be? Successful in appearance but disconnected from actual purpose." The question led to months of reflection and planning that would reshape the foundation's structure one final time. Drawing on lessons I'd learned from 25 years of managing inherited wealth, we developed what Jennifer called the Legacy Renewal Protocol, a systematic approach to ensuring that the foundation's future leadership would be selected based on commitment to service rather than administrative competence or social connections. "The key insight," I explained to the Foundation's board during the presentation of our new governance structure, "is that effective leadership of community-serving organizations requires understanding the lived experiences of the people being served, not just expertise in nonprofit management." The Legacy Renewal Protocol included several innovative features. Board positions reserved for Foundation alumni who'd experienced the programs as recipients before becoming advocates. Leadership development programs that required future executives to work directly with families facing crises before assuming administrative responsibilities, and decision-making processes that prioritized input from community members over recommendations from professional consultants. "We're essentially institutionalizing the values that made the foundation effective," Jennifer explained, while creating mechanisms to prevent those values from being compromised by conventional organizational pressures. The new governance structure attracted attention from philanthropic researchers who were studying how successful foundations maintained their mission focus over multiple generations of leadership. "Dr. Blackwood," said Professor Angela Martinez from the Stanford School of Philanthropy, "your foundation's approach to succession planning addresses one of the most persistent challenges in family philanthropy: how to preserve founding values while adapting to changing community needs." Professor Martinez was leading a research project that studied foundations established by inherited wealth, focusing on factors that determined whether they maintained community connection or evolved into institutional self-preservation. Our preliminary findings suggest that foundations are most likely to remain community-focused when their leadership includes people who've experienced the problems the foundation addresses, rather than just people who are good at managing charitable organizations. Professor Martinez, that aligns with what we've observed over 25 years of foundation operations. The most effective programming decisions came from staff members who understood beneficiary perspectives personally rather than just professionally. The research collaboration led to development of what became known as the Blackwood Model for Philanthropic Governance, a framework that other foundations began adopting to ensure their leadership remained connected to community needs rather than just organizational management. But the most meaningful validation of our approach came from an unexpected source. A call from the White House Office of Social Innovation requesting a meeting about federal adoption of community-based philanthropic principles. Ms. Blackwood, said Director Patricia Williams during our video conference, the administration is developing new guidelines for federal community development funding, and your foundation's model has been cited by policy researchers as an example of effective resource allocation that achieves measurable long-term impact. The meeting led to my appointment as a senior advisor to the Federal Commission on Community Investment Strategy, where I worked with policymakers to develop funding criteria that prioritized community partnership and sustainable outcomes over traditional metrics like administrative efficiency and program size. The federal government has historically funded community development through large institutions that operate programs for beneficiaries, I explained to the Commission. But our experience suggests that community partnership models, where residents participate in designing and implementing interventions, achieve better outcomes with more sustainable impact. The Commission's final recommendations influenced federal policy in ways that extended the Foundation's impact far beyond our direct programming. Community development grants began requiring meaningful resident participation in planning and evaluation. Educational funding started prioritizing programs that served families holistically rather than just providing isolated services to individual students. Jennifer observed during one of our planning meetings, "You've managed to influence policy at a level that multiplies the Foundation's impact thousands of times over. Federal agencies are now using principles you developed through community-based programming." Jennifer, that's exactly what Grandfather hoped would happen when he trusted me with his inheritance. He wanted the Foundation to demonstrate approaches that other organizations could adapt and scale. As I entered my final year of active involvement with the Foundation, I began planning my own legacy in ways that honored both Grandfather's trust and the lessons I'd learned from 25 years of managing inherited wealth. The most important decision involved my personal estate, which had grown significantly through careful investment and modest living expenses. Following Grandfather's example, I chose to surprise my family with inheritance decisions that prioritized service over status. "Jennifer," I said during a private meeting in my study, "I want to discuss something with you before my attorney finalizes my estate planning. Aunt Emma, you don't need to involve me in your personal financial decisions." "Actually, I do, because those decisions will affect the Foundation's future and your family's opportunities." I explained that I was leaving my personal assets, approximately $15 million, to establish an endowment specifically for training future Foundation leaders, according to the principles we developed through the Legacy Renewal Protocol. The endowment will fund fellowship programs that give recent college graduates the opportunity to work directly with families facing crises before pursuing graduate education in social work, public policy, or nonprofit management. "And Emma, that's an extraordinary gift. But what about your own family? What about Michael and David and the other young people who might benefit from inheritance?" "Jennifer, they'll benefit more from opportunities to earn meaningful work than from receiving unearned wealth. The fellowship program will provide exactly those opportunities while ensuring that the Foundation's future leadership understands community needs from personal experience rather than just professional training." The Emma Blackwood Fellowship Program was announced at the Foundation's 25th anniversary celebration, held once again in the Community Education Center that had originally been the family estate. The event brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Foundation programming. Scholarship recipients who'd become community leaders, families who'd achieved stability through comprehensive support services, and young professionals who'd found meaningful careers through Foundation-supported job training and education programs. 25 years ago, I said during my remarks, my grandfather entrusted me with resources and responsibility that seemed overwhelming. Tonight, I'm entrusting those same resources to a new generation of leaders who understand that inherited advantages create obligations to help others discover their own potential. Jennifer spoke next, outlining the fellowship program and the Foundation's plans for continued community-based programming under the guidance of people who'd experienced both the challenges and the support systems that made transformation possible. Aunt Emma taught her family that the most meaningful success comes from creating opportunities for others, rather than accumulating advantages for ourselves. The fellowship program will ensure that future Foundation leaders learn those lessons through direct experience rather than just theoretical study. The celebration concluded with testimonials from Foundation alumni who'd gone on to establish their own community-serving organizations in cities across the country. Each speaker shared stories about programs they'd developed based on principles they'd learned through Foundation programming, creating a network of community-based initiatives that extended the Foundation's impact far beyond its direct operations. Ms. Blackwood, said Dr. Maria Santos, who'd been one of our first scholarship recipients and was now running a family services organization in Phoenix, I wanted to thank you for showing me that success means building something that serves your community, rather than just advancing your own circumstances. The Foundation didn't just give me educational opportunities, added Roberto Martinez, who'd established a small business development program in Los Angeles. It taught me that whatever advantages I achieved created responsibilities to help others access similar opportunities. As the evening concluded and guests departed to continue their own community work, I reflected on the journey from that funeral where I'd been invisible to this celebration of sustainable community impact that would continue long after my direct involvement ended. The inheritance that had shocked everyone 25 years earlier had become the foundation for work that demonstrated how wealth could serve character development rather than replacing it, how resources could create opportunities rather than just comfort, how success could be measured by lives touched rather than assets accumulated. Aunt Emma, Jennifer said as we walked through the center's halls, past classrooms where community members were learning job skills and meeting rooms where families were receiving support services, can I ask you something I've wondered about for years? Of course. Do you ever regret the choices you made? The modest lifestyle you maintained, the recognition you could have claimed, the personal advantages you could have pursued with grandfather's inheritance? I thought about the question while looking at photographs that documented 25 years of Foundation work, scholarship recipients at graduation ceremonies, families celebrating homeownership, community centers bustling with educational and support programs. Jennifer, I've learned that the most satisfying advantages are the ones you create for others, rather than the ones you claim for yourself. Grandfather's inheritance gave me the opportunity to prove that service is more fulfilling than status, that creating possibilities for others is more meaningful than accumulating privileges for yourself. Any regrets at all? Only that it took a funeral, where I was treated like a nobody, to discover that being overlooked was often just the beginning of the most important stories. 2 months later, I was admitted to the hospital for what doctors initially thought would be routine surgery, but discovered was a more serious condition requiring extended treatment. As I lay in the hospital bed reflecting on a life that had been shaped by unexpected inheritance and unanticipated responsibilities, I found myself thinking about legacy in ways that went beyond financial planning or organizational succession. Jennifer visited daily, bringing updates about Foundation operations and fellowship program applications, but also sharing observations about how the family's transformation had influenced her own children's understanding of wealth and responsibility. Aunt Emma, Sarah is only 15, but she's already talking about careers in community development because she's grown up seeing that meaningful work is more satisfying than just profitable work. And Michael Jr.? I asked about Jennifer's 12-year-old son. He's organizing recycling programs and food drives at school because he says families that have more than they need should help families that don't have enough. He learned that from watching the Foundation's work, but also from seeing how our entire family changed its approach to using advantages for community benefit. As my hospital stay extended into weeks, I received visits from Foundation alumni who'd become community leaders, family members who'd found more meaningful approaches to their professional work, and young people who'd benefited from programs that addressed their needs while recognizing their potential. Ms. Blackwood, said Dr. David Chen, who'd been one of our fellowship recipients and was now directing a community health center, I wanted to thank you for showing me that professional success could be a tool for community service rather than just personal advancement. The fellowship program didn't just fund my education. added Sarah Williams, who was completing her doctorate in social work. It taught me that whatever expertise I developed created obligations to serve people facing the same challenges I'd experienced growing up. The steady stream of visitors reminded me that the most important legacy wasn't the foundation's institutional success, but the understanding it had helped people develop about the relationship between personal advantages and community responsibility. 3 weeks into my hospital stay, Mr. Davidson's son Jonathan, who had taken over his father's law practice, visited to discuss final details of my estate planning and the legal structures that would ensure the foundation's continued operation according to its founding principles. Ms. Blackwood, I wanted to assure you that the governance structures you and Jennifer developed will protect the Foundation's mission focus for generations. The Legacy Renewal Protocol creates mechanisms that make it very difficult for future leadership to prioritize institutional prestige over community service. Jonathan, your father helped my grandfather plan an inheritance that shocked everyone but achieved exactly what he intended. I hope we've done the same thing. Created structures that will surprise people with their effectiveness while honoring the values that made the work meaningful. 2 days later, surrounded by family members who'd learned to measure success by community impact rather than personal accumulation, I passed away peacefully, knowing that the work would continue under leadership that understood both its practical requirements and its underlying purpose. The funeral service was held in the same church where grandfather's service had taken place 25 years earlier. But the atmosphere was entirely different. Instead of business associates discussing financial legacies and social acquaintances maintaining appropriate appearances, the gathering included hundreds of people whose lives had been directly touched by foundation programming and family business transformation. Emma Blackwood was treated like a nobody at a funeral 25 years ago, Jennifer said during her eulogy, because people measured her worth by conventional standards that completely missed her actual value. Today we gather to celebrate someone who proved that being underestimated was often just the beginning of the most important stories. The service included testimonials from Foundation alumni, family members who'd found more meaningful approaches to their work, and community leaders who'd been influenced by programming that treated people as partners rather than beneficiaries. Ms. Blackwood taught us that the most meaningful inheritance isn't money, said Maria Santos, now directing community services in 3 cities. It's the understanding that whatever advantages you possess, create opportunities to help others discover their own potential. After the service, as people gathered to share memories and discuss the Foundation's future, Mrs. Harrison approached Jennifer with a perspective that captured something essential about the journey from dismissal to recognition. Jennifer, 25 years ago I failed to recognize your aunt's extraordinary character because I was measuring worth by superficial standards. Watching what she built with your great-grandfather's legacy taught me that true success isn't about accumulating advantages. It's about using whatever advantages you have to create opportunities for others. 6 months after my death, the Blackwood Foundation received the Presidential Medal for Community Service, recognizing its influence on federal policy and its demonstration of effective approaches to community-based philanthropy. Jennifer accepted the award on behalf of the Foundation's staff, alumni, and community partners. But she used the ceremony to share something about legacy that honored both grandfather's original vision and the lessons learned through 25 years of implementing that vision. Emma Blackwood was treated like a nobody at a funeral because people couldn't see past their assumptions about worth and success, she told the White House audience. But being overlooked gave her the freedom to build something that measured value by lives touched rather than recognition received, by communities strengthened rather than personal status achieved. The foundation she created will continue serving community needs long after anyone remembers who established it, because she understood that the most meaningful legacies are the ones that keep giving, rather than the ones that demand acknowledgement. The Presidential Medal ceremony concluded with an announcement that the federal government would be adopting Blackwood principles for all community development funding, criteria that prioritized community partnership, sustainable outcomes, and leadership development over traditional metrics of administrative efficiency and program size. 25 years after a funeral where Emma Blackwood had been treated like a nobody, her approach to inherited wealth and community responsibility had influenced national policy and demonstrated that being underestimated was often just the beginning of stories that changed the world. The executor they'd never expected had become exactly what her grandfather had hoped for. Someone who could transform inherited advantages into shared benefits that honored both individual potential and collective responsibility for community development. And in communities across the country, young people were learning that true success meant using whatever resources they possessed to create opportunities for others to discover their own capabilities and contribute to something larger than personal comfort or family privilege. The nobody they'd dismissed at a funeral had become someone who proved that the greatest inheritances were the ones that multiplied when shared. That the most meaningful wealth was what you created for others, and that being overlooked was often just the first chapter of the most important stories. 25 years after a funeral where Emma Blackwood had been treated like a nobody, her approach to inherited wealth and community responsibility had influenced national policy and demonstrated that being underestimated was often just the beginning of stories that changed the world. The executor they'd never expected had become exactly what her grandfather had hoped for, someone who could transform inherited advantages into shared benefits that honored both individual potential and collective responsibility for community development. Years later, when business schools taught case studies about the Blackwood model of philanthropic governance, students would learn about a family that discovered wealth was a tool for creating opportunities rather than accumulating privileges. When policymakers discussed effective community development strategies, they referenced principles developed by someone who'd been dismissed as irrelevant at her own grandfather's funeral. The Foundation's fellowship program continued producing leaders who understood service from personal experience rather than just professional training. Richard's law firm had inspired dozens of similar practices that prioritized client outcomes over billable hours. Patricia's philanthropic consulting had helped establish community-focused giving programs in over 50 cities. The family's transformation had become a template for how inherited wealth could serve character development rather than replacing it. Jennifer's children grew up in a family where success was measured by community impact rather than personal accumulation. Sarah Blackwood, now 25, was completing her medical residency while developing programs that integrated healthcare with housing and educational support. Michael Jr., 22, had started a nonprofit that taught financial literacy to families transitioning out of poverty, using approaches he'd learned from watching the Foundation's work since childhood. The ripple effects extended far beyond the Blackwood family. Former Foundation alumni had established similar organizations in dozens of cities, creating a network of community-based programming that served hundreds of thousands of families annually. The Blackwood principles had influenced federal policy so significantly that community development funding now required meaningful resident participation and long-term outcome measurement, rather than just administrative efficiency. And in communities across the country, young people were learning that true success meant using whatever resources they possessed to create opportunities for others to discover their own capabilities and contribute to something larger than personal comfort or family privilege. Mrs. Harrison, now in her 90s, would often tell her neighbors about the funeral where everyone had missed recognizing the most important person in the room. "We all thought we knew what success looked like," she'd say, but Emma Blackwood taught us that the most meaningful achievements are often invisible until they change everything. On the 30th anniversary of David Blackwood's death, the community education center that had once been the family estate hosted a celebration that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Foundation programming. The event wasn't about honoring Emma's memory, it was about celebrating the ongoing work that proved her understanding of inheritance and responsibility. Great-Aunt Emma always said that the best legacies were the ones that kept growing long after their creators were gone, Sarah Blackwood told the gathering. Tonight, we see evidence that she was right. The work continues, the impact multiplies, and the principles she demonstrated keep inspiring new approaches to community service and family responsibility. The nobody they'd dismissed at a funeral had become someone who proved that the greatest inheritances were the ones that multiplied when shared, that the most meaningful wealth was what you created for others, and that being overlooked was often just the first chapter of the most important stories. The will that named her executor hadn't just transferred money. It had revealed that sometimes the family disappointment was actually the family's greatest hope, and that true legacy lived not in what you accumulated, but in what you inspired others to build long after you were gone. At the funeral, they'd treated her like a nobody, but the nobody they'd overlooked had understood something they'd missed. That worth wasn't measured by recognition received, but by lives touched, communities strengthened, and possibilities created for others to discover their own potential to serve something greater than themselves. 30 years later, thousands of people who'd never heard Emma Blackwood's name were living better lives because of work she'd started, principles she'd demonstrated, and understanding she'd shared about the relationship between inherited advantages and community responsibility. The greatest victories, she'd always believed, were the ones that became so embedded in how the world worked that no one remembered they'd once been revolutionary ideas proposed by someone the important people had failed to notice. The family disappointment had become the family's greatest gift to the world, proof that being underestimated was often just the universe's way of giving you the freedom to exceed every expectation and build something beautiful from the quiet satisfaction of knowing the impact mattered more than the recognition. The end.